Personality disorders are considered by many professionals to be some of the most difficult to diagnose. Luckily, Dr. Ramani is the go-to expert when it comes to this class of conditions. She sat down with MedCircle to dive into Cluster B personality disorders, which are known to be the most unpredictable type.
It's just so great to sit down with you.
I love talking with you.
Sometimes we talk about some topics that I think are really, really dreadful and hurtful.
Yeah.
And I think this series is going to be more in that lane.
Yes, it is, yeah. You brought up the cluster B?
Yeah.
Personality disorders. I think I'm so glad we're doing this, having this conversation, because a lot of folks out there are trying to make sense of these difficult patterns, and they put in all kinds of words into search engines online. Cluster B is something that comes out, and a lot of people don't know how to make sense of it. So let me give you some historical background. This word cluster B, it comes from how the personality disorders were traditionally organized in the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatry and Psychology, called the DSM. The DSM organized the personality disorders, there were 10 of them, into 3 groups: cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. And they organized the disorders based on their manifestations. Now, back in graduate school, we would remember these 3 clusters by calling them mad, bad, and sad. That's how we sort of memorized them. And by mad, it was sort of that traditional, like, madman, like, a person who's just really off and almost like, very disturbed. Bad meant almost badly behaved, and that's our cluster Bs. And sad were people who are more anxious and avoidant. The cluster B disorders are also termed dramatic and erratic. Now, these disorders, again, are grouped by sort of how they affect a person, and today we're going to focus on cluster B. The cluster B disorders are the difficult disorders. They're antagonistic. They're interpersonally challenging. These are folks who, as a rule, almost always lack empathy. They tend to be entitled. So it's almost like narcissism becomes a nice sort of like the midpoint of a lot of these disorders. Like, most of them have qualities of narcissism in different ways. And as you said, the 4 disorders that hang out in cluster B are antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and something called histrionic personality disorder. These are probably the most clinically vexing patterns we see in psychology and psychiatry, because they can make for very difficult clients. These patterns can interfere with us treating other issues the person may have, like substance abuse, bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, the list goes on. If you have a cluster B disorder and these other things, you're constantly sort of like, it's like you're trying to like fight 2 different battles at the same time, and it's really one big kind of war, if you will. So it is a challenge, and it's a challenge for people not only living with the cluster B patterns, but also a challenge for the people living with those people who have cluster B patterns. So that's what cluster B is: dramatic, erratic, emotional, antagonistic, combative, lacking empathy, oftentimes internally very chaotic. They can't regulate their emotions very easily. And some of these are really clinically demanding. Borderline personality, for example, is a very clinically challenging condition. Narcissistic, histrionic clients, they don't even tend to end up in therapy that often. And antisocial personality disorder, those folks often end up in prison.
We've talked about specific personality disorders, but what is a personality disorder in general?
A personality disorder is a maladaptive pattern of behavior and relating that cuts across all situations in the person's life: relationships, work, social functioning, and even their sense of self. It's the long-standing stability that makes these be called personality disorders, because personality is considered to be a stable trait. But their personality styles cause the person problems in all areas of their life. But it's the maladaptive, consistent, and stable nature of these problematic personality patterns that lead to them being called personality disorders.
Can someone be diagnosed as having cluster B disorder? No.
Yeah,
you just have one of them, and then that's
yeah.
clustered.
What would end up happening is, like, for example, as you know, I do research on psychopathology and mental illness and mental health. So when we analyze our data, because these disorders are common, sometimes we'll combine these patterns to see if we see any patterns there. So partly it serves as sort of a research kind of an approach. It becomes a shorthand for clinicians, but we as clinicians have to be really, really careful about using that term, because cluster B is code for difficult difficult patient. And there's a
Wait, that's
chance
really
you get-
big.
Yeah.
Cluster B is code for difficult patient. Now,
Yeah.
I can already hear people though saying, well, I'm watching that. My therapist said I have cluster B. Now that's rude. Why would you say I'm
It can
difficult?
feel rude. That's why I'm saying we have to be very careful with these labels. It's really meant, it's almost like, again, it's an organizational scheme. If we see, because what may happen, Kyle, is a person may not meet the full diagnostic criteria for any one pattern of those disorders. We chose 4 disorders. They may have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And we might call it, this sort of has a cluster B pattern to it. It means that we might use very specific kinds of therapeutic techniques, or realize that these patterns may interfere with the treatment of other disorders, if you will. But it does imply typically somebody who's interpersonally difficult. I'll be honest with you, I mean, those of us in mental health will sometimes even use that as shorthand in our own lives.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to Thanksgiving, it's gonna be difficult, I have cluster B relatives there. You know, anyone in the business will know, like, she's got some really difficult family members. But it's beyond difficult. It's antagonistic and almost like they often don't get it.
Is it almost often that they don't want the help?
Not necessarily. I think, you know, because cluster B disorders take in so much territory, I work with many clients who have borderline personality disorder. They desperately want help. They desperately want help. In fact, sometimes need more help than even they can get in sort of like 1 or 2 weekly therapy sessions. And many clients with borderline personality disorder are very invested in getting that help, but it's difficult for them. They feel so internally chaotic and frightened that therapy can be challenging not only for them, but for the therapist who's trying to sort of soothe this patient. Obviously, when you're dealing with somebody with narcissistic personality, they don't think anything's wrong. So they're often going to think, I don't even need help. And then, you know, histrionic personality disorder, actually, they're thinking of removing that from the diagnostic manual. These are people who are dramatic and attention-seeking and seductive, and look at me, how come I'm not getting all the attention kind of thing. They almost also never end up seeking out treatment for that particular pattern. The folks with antisocial personality disorder also almost never seek out treatment. They get in trouble for something, and then they're sometimes forced into treatment.
Briefly describe what antisocial personality disorder is, because that name is so misleading.
Antisocial personality disorder is one of the most important and one of the most unfortunately named diagnoses out there. It throws my students off, it throws off trainees, it throws off lay people. Antisocial personality disorder is actually quite dangerous. It can be quite dangerous. It doesn't mean what we think. A lot of people take the antisocial to mean, oh, these are people who don't want to be with other people, almost as though they're socially anxious. Not at all. The unfortunate term historically came from this idea that these were people who were anti-society. They were anti the norms of society. They would break the rules of society. That was where the antisocial came from. Like I said, such an unfortunate name, because we use antisocial to mean someone who doesn't want to socialize. Like,
what would you call it?
I would call it psychopathic personality disorder.
Yes.
That's what I would term it. And antisocial personality disorder is the diagnostic term for things that are called psychopathy and sociopathy in the popular literature, in the media at large, in all kinds of other writing, in criminology writing, but it's not a diagnostic, those are not diagnostic terms, but those two terms definitely ascribe more to antisocial personality disorder. Now, what is it? Antisocial personality disorder is a pattern whereby a person not only lacks empathy, but they think the rules do not apply to them, they do not adhere to them, they break moral codes, social codes, legal codes. They have a failure to take any kind of responsibility. They're very deceitful. They exploit other people to achieve their ends. They will take risks that will put other people in danger. So they're dangerous. They're dangerous. And here's the ringer. Here's the ringer. I personally think that to really call it antisocial personality disorder, you're talking about someone who lacks remorse for the bad things they do. And that's where it gets scary.
Can they fake it?
That's where it gets scary. I'm sorry?
Can they fake it?
Can a person fake,
remorse.
They fake remorse? Oh, absolutely. You can fake anything. You can fake empathy, you can fake remorse, you can fake anything. And they do. They will, when they're finally hauled in front of the press conference, they'll cry crocodile tears, and a year later they'll do it again. That's antisocial personality disorder.
Which clusters of disorders do you think are most common?
In terms of the personality disorders overall, I actually think that the cluster B disorders may be more common. And the only reason I think I'm going to say that is because when we do research on these disorders, they're the ones that are more clinically compelling. So we may see more clients with these patterns because especially in the case of borderline personality, they're more likely to get help.
That's right.
In the case of antisocial personality disorder, they're more likely to end up in prison. So there are these two groups of folks we study a lot because of the sort of the distress we see in borderline personality and the danger that can be created by antisocial personality. So if you were, and there's 4 disorders in that group too, so it's going to up your number up a little bit. I think that the cluster B disorders probably are the ones that have the highest prevalence rates across the 3 groups overall. Yeah.
Well, you have more disorders and people are having to go get help. So
they're more disruptive. That's who you're going to see. I'd say if you were working in the mental health business, you'll see that a lot. In cluster C, there's things like avoidant personality disorder, which is, it almost looks like a social anxiety disorder. So you will see that sometimes, but sometimes we don't even know which variant we're seeing, social anxiety or avoidant personality. And with the cluster A disorders, the schizoid, the schizotypal, the paranoid personalities, these are people who actually look quite severely mentally ill. They're incredibly either socially withdrawn or they appear as so odd, they almost look psychotic. They're sometimes overrepresented in residentially unstable, like homeless populations or people who are in and out of long-term psychiatric facilities.
Is there hope for people who are in the cluster B camp?
In terms of hope for cluster B clients, it varies. It varies.
Hold on. We don't hear that answer a lot.
Oh, it varies, yeah. And that's the problem. That speaks to how heterogeneous the disorders that make up this cluster are.
If I talk about bipolar disorder, if I talk about anxiety, depression, ADHD, the doctor across from me will say, there's so much hope.
No, very variable. I would say that the most good research on treatment outcomes and best practices can be found for borderline personality disorder. I believe firmly that if you have a client with borderline personality disorder and you can give them trauma-focused care, dialectical behavioral therapy, whatever psychiatric medications they may need to manage other sorts of conditions they have, and other kinds of adjunctive therapies that will help them with their symptoms, the treatment literature can really show some good long-term outcomes, but the treatment has to be consistent and long-term, and that's often beyond the financial ability of a lot of people. That's what's so unfortunate, because I think there is tremendous hope for people with borderline personality if they get the kinds of treatment. And if the client won't cooperate with the treatment, then all bets are off. With narcissistic personality disorder, you know what I say about that, you're not going to see much change. And when you do, it's glacial, and the amount of change you see is often not enough for the people around them to feel like things are better. But with antisocial personality disorder, that disorder might be the most hopeless of all. These are folks who will try to outwit and outfox a therapist, who will fake it and are often court-ordered to go to therapy as a condition of parole or probation or something like that. And so they'll sit there for 10 sessions and say, I don't need to say anything, I just need you to sign that document that said I came here for 10 sessions. So you can get a lot of resistance, and they can often try to intimidate a therapist. You have to be a very specially trained therapist to work with that population, particularly those who have very, very difficult criminal histories. And if you're dealing with sort of the more neat and tied up antisocial personality disorder, like the CEO variant, they're very manipulative. They can be very exploitative. Again, they will often try to outwit the therapist. They're really not motivated to change because they really, truly don't think there's anything to change. So if anything, they're just really out to game the system. That's not progress. So I would say definitely for them, of all groups, they'll have the worst outcomes.
What percentage of your clients do you think fall in the cluster B category?
With some cluster B symptomatology, well over 50%. Maybe even a little less.
Actually, I thought you were going to say 5%.
Oh, heck no. No. And actually, that's what I choose to focus in. But maybe 40%.
You know, that is good, though, because now at least people are getting help or in the space to get help.
And there are people out there who specialize in this, like people who specialize in dialectical behavioral therapy, it's called DBT. I'd say they see 90% because they're working with clients who have a lot of borderline personality sorts of symptoms. People who work in prisons are probably seeing antisocial personality at the level of 60-70%. But I'd say almost half of the clients I work with, I choose to do that though, because like I said, although I would say maybe even, all right, I'll be 35%, because the majority of clients I work with are trying to negotiate a family or other relationship with a person with a cluster B disorder. A solid third of them are struggling with these issues.
Well, that leads perfectly into my next question. Knowing that if somebody has watched this video this far, they have been likely given a diagnosis of a disorder in the cluster B family, or they know somebody who has. What could I ask them on their behalf that you would think would be most beneficial for them to hear?
I think that the big question people have is, from the person, there's two sides of it. From the side of the person who's experiencing it is, what do I do? I'm not only always miserable, I feel like I'm making people miserable. And then from the other side, I think the question would be, what do I do? I feel like nothing I say to this person ever makes things better. In fact, all I do is feel like things get worse, and I feel like I'm always walking on eggshells. What do I do?
And
so it's really, what do I do?
Yeah, what's the answer to that?
I mean, for the people who are experiencing this symptomatology, you got to get therapy. You're not going to think your way out of this one. You're not going to meditate your way out of this one. You got to get therapy, and with somebody who is trained in things like DBT and working with these kinds of patterns. Okay, that's have to.
Yes, Dr. Yip is one of the nation's leading experts on OCD, and I interviewed her for our OCD series. She really drove home the point of, don't just go get therapy because the therapist said, yeah, I treat OCD. Go find the person who that's what they do.
That's what they do.
They are OCD, right? So with these people, I feel bad for someone who might have gone to a therapist who said they could treat it, but they did it once 10 years ago and they had a bad experience.
Yeah. I think that especially with something like narcissistic personality disorder, if you actually do get them to therapy, you can use a combination of some DBT techniques, but also some cognitive behavioral work, some humanistic work, rapport building. A lot of it's relationship building. You need a strong therapist to work with those clients because they will try to outfox you. And so you almost have to be one step ahead of them. Like you can't fall for the charm. You have to be almost charm immune or charm proof to work with the narcissistic clients. With the so it's all about expertise, but the borderline clients are the ones who are most likely to actually seek out therapy. And for them to say, like I said, you do it right. What do? You need to get help from somebody who knows what they're doing. And it might even be a team of people who know what they're doing. In fact, DBT is best delivered in a team approach with a combination of group therapy and individual therapy and some medication management. On the other side of it, if somebody in your life is experiencing these cluster B patterns, it's going to be difficult. I'm telling you that right now. And you're not a bad person for thinking it's difficult. Because a lot of people, I feel guilty, there's actually something happening to them. How dare I think that this is difficult? Because it is. Because the nature of these patterns is somewhat antagonistic. That again, it may be that they're feeling insecure or chaotic inside, and that's why they're lashing out. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. When somebody lashes out, it doesn't feel good, regardless of the reason. And so I will tell people, if you are with somebody who's experiencing cluster B patterns, definitely seek out individual therapy. You may need to manage your expectations of that person, and then ask yourself, what would the landscape of a relationship look like with this person if things don't change? Because in many cases, it may not change.
Those are really good 3 takeaways. Real quick for people watching, explain briefly what DBT is.
Yeah, DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy. Dialectical behavior therapy was developed by someone named Dr. Marsha Linehan, and she developed DBT actually specifically to address the crisis of suicidality in people who had borderline personality disorder, because that's the dangerous issue. People with borderline personality are experiencing so much inner pain and turmoil that they want to silence that pain. They truly do believe often they're a burden to others, that they're not worthy to live. It's really agonizing for them and for the people around them who care for them. And so DBT was initially really developed as a way for the person living with borderline personality disorder to see how life always feels like a crisis to them, how everything is black or white. And so the dialectic is really to bring those two sides, those two perspectives together and find that gray in the middle. The other thing that Dr. Linehan brought into this work was a real focus on mindfulness. People with borderline personality disorder tend to react instead of responding. Responding is a more thoughtful approach. Reacting is like you jump right in. Through DBT, using mindfulness and sort of catching yourself, you help people construct more responsive rather than reactive kinds of approaches when they're faced with a stressor. You know, because the reacting often means people's feelings get hurt, people get angry, but to help them deal with that crisis and the fears that overtake a person with borderline personality disorder, such as things like that they're going to be left, that they're going to be alone, that they can't take care of themselves. Many people with borderline personality disorder engage in a lot of negative self-talk. Dialectical behavioral therapy also draws from cognitive behavioral therapy, where you push back and say, you know, it's interesting you say all these terrible things about yourself, because my experience, and you really do point out to them the good things and the strengths, and you do some resilience building with them. So, and you have them do homework assignments between sessions, so they do a lot more monitoring, so they can start seeing their own patterns. DBT has been shown to reduce the rate of suicidal thoughts, suicidal actions in people with borderline personality disorder, and it's really the only evidence-based treatment we know of right now that has any consistently good outcomes in persons with borderline personality.
I just want to touch on two things you said that really struck a chord with me. The first one is mindfulness. It is becoming a reoccurring theme in all of my conversations about mental health.
Yes,
which makes me think if there's one thing we all could do to make our lives better, it would be to be conscious of what we're doing, mindful of what we're doing. And then the second thing is that difference between reacting and responding.
Yeah.
That's huge.
We live in a very reactive world. I mean, especially when you think about tweeting and texting. And
responding to those tweets and texts.
But that's reacting to those tweets and texts.
Yeah.
Responding means you stop, you think, what's meaningful, what would make sure, how do I write this so I don't hurt people? You know, that it's actually beneficial to either the receiver or other people who will be seeing this message. You go through a series of cognitive steps. But unfortunately, technology doesn't, I mean, I wish all technology made you like, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? Like, you know,
that's an app idea.
And then, you know, and honestly, they made you, like, it went 60 seconds.
Yeah. And
then another, are you sure? And then another 60 seconds. And then, are you sure? Because by then, a lot of reacting would have come down, and you're like, oh, forget about it. It's not that important.
Yeah, I mean, think about those emails that you write in a rage, and hopefully you don't send them, and you save it, and then the next morning you read it and go, thank goodness I didn't send that
Never
email.
ever put a name in a subject line of an email until you're ready to send it. Yeah. That's sort of a bit of advice. But it's that react, respond, and mindfulness are linked. And because everything these days is so quick, and we're judged on speed, and everything's designed not only for speed, but not to catch ourselves before we go off the edge, that we can send things without, you know, back in the day, you'd have to like write the letter, fold the letter, put the letter in the envelope, find the stamp, write the address, go to the mailbox. That was 9 times you could have said, maybe I shouldn't send this.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's where that mindfulness is a stop, it's a feel, it's a think, but that does mean awareness of other people. And if you don't have empathy, all the mindfulness in the world may not necessarily pay out.